Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my review of The Woman in Black, not the film, but the book by Susan Hill, no relation of friend of the channel, Sandra Hill. This book was written in 1983 and has been force-fed to school children across the UK ever since. This is a gothic ghost story full of extreme gloomy weather, isolated houses, spooky ruins and graveyards, and secrets behind every door, locked or not. As usual, if you'd prefer to skip the plot summary, there's a time on your screen. Slide the YouTube thing along until it's at that point, but I make no guarantee that any part of the review will be spoiler-free. Woman in Black starts with a frame story. Arthur Kipps is spending a happy Christmas with his wife, stepkids and grandchildren. Where his non-step family is not mentioned, but the step family are swapping ghost stories for fun in the Edwardian period. People had all sorts of difficulties connecting to the internet. And when his son asks Arthur if he had a scary story to share, a rattled Arthur makes excuses and leaves the room. As our narrator, this book is entirely written in the first person. Arthur tells us that he is writing a little later, having composed himself and having resolved to write down the story he's not brave enough to speak aloud. The narrative then switches to some years earlier when Arthur was a junior in a law firm and sent to the remote village of Crithyn Gifford to wrap up the affairs of a reclusive and now deceased client, Mrs Drablow. On the train there he meets Samuel Bayley, a local of Crithyn Gifford. The two make chit-chat, but Bayley is reticent to talk too much about Mrs Drablow, but he does give Arthur his card along with the all-encompassing message, in case you need anyone. Arthur then meets Mr Jerome, who handled a smattering of business for Mrs Drablow, and the two men attend her funeral where Arthur observes only one other guest, a woman in black who appears terribly ill. On remarking to Mr Jerome about her, though, Jerome is seriously distressed and almost faints. He refuses to discuss the sighting with Arthur, continuing the pattern of people refusing to discuss the Drablows with him, following on from Samuel Bayley and the landlord of the inn where he's staying. Arthur is slightly annoyed by their behaviour, calling it superstitious when he learns that there is only one person in the village willing to take him to the Drablow estate, a cart driver called Kipps. When he visits the deserted Drablow House, Arthur explores the ground and sees the woman again, and she makes him feel very uneasy. She disappears and he begins to believe that he has seen a ghost. He checks the house and finds that Mrs Drablow has left a lot of stuff that he's going to need to go through. He finds the house's isolation unpleasant and resolves to go through her things as rapidly and as efficiently as possible, staying in the house if necessary. However, he reconsiders that after experiencing the house and decides to walk back to the village, expecting to meet Kipps on the way. However, a fog closes in and he gets lost. Hearing a pony and trap getting stuck in the mud, he works his way back to the house. Kipps arrives in the early hours, saying it's unsafe to travel to the house because it's surrounded by marshy land which is dangerous in the fog, but that he wouldn't dare leave Arthur in the house overnight. They return to the inn, and the next morning Arthur tries to enlist Jerome's help sorting through Drablow's effects. Jerome, clearly very unnerved by the idea, refuses and assures Arthur that nobody locally will be willing to help him at the house. Seeing their fearful reaction, though, emboldens Arthur, and he resolves to return to the house, staying overnight to sort out the papers as quickly as possible. Samuel Bayley, also refusing to go to the house, instead lends Arthur a dog called Spider for company. Overnight, however, things get very spooky at the house. The dog is clearly terrified by a constant knocking coming from the building's only locked room, and the next morning Arthur finds some papers that begin to reveal a little bit about the history of the Drablow family. The sound of the sinking pony and trap is repeated overnight, as is the knocking this time, though the door is open and reveals a decorated nursery. Then someone whistles and Spider rushes out into the marsh in response, getting stuck in the mud too, desperately trying to escape. Arthur rushes to rescue her, and the two barely make it out with their lives, passing out as the sound of a pony and trap repeats in the fog. This time, though, it is Bayley and not the mere ghostly sounds of the night. Arthur then stays with the Bayley family, who nurse him back to health. He reads the last of the Drablow papers and discovers the truth about the family, that Janet Humphrey, Mrs Drablow's sister, conceived a child out of wedlock, and he and his escort were lost in the fog and drowned in the marsh. Jeanette has since haunted the region, and sightings of her lead to the death of a local child, including that of Mr Jerome, hence his extreme reaction to the Drablows. Arthur considers that maybe that curse is over because nobody has died during his current experiences at the house. A few years later, though, Arthur and his first wife and young child are at a parade when he sees the woman in black, and there are tragic consequences. And the book finishes returning to the present day where Arthur, who's just finished writing his book, says, "They asked for my story, I have told it. Enough." Though set in the Edwardian period, Woman in Black is written in the style of a faux Victorian novel. The frame story, the rather stiff and stoic narrator, the expertly handled gothic tone, all add to that feeling. In a way, it helps create the creepy atmosphere that pervades the story, though perhaps less so to those expecting a more modern take, such as the recent film adaptation. This is a ghost story about things that go bump in the night, rather than a nighttime slasher. It plays on our fear of the unknown, the mysterious. The frame story, Arthur's reaction to his family's stories, sets this up as something momentous before it even really starts. In London, before he leaves for Criffin Gifford, he's surrounded by a foul green fog, cold and impenetrable, so that everything is obfuscated and hidden. Arriving in the village, indeed on the train journey there, people refuse to fully communicate. Even his discussion with his boss is cut short with the question, "Isn't there any more you ought to tell me?" hanging unanswered in the gloom. Bayley on the train, the innkeeper he stays with, both clearly hold back some kind of local secret or superstition. Arthur, the stoic Victorian and metropolitan gentleman, is annoyed by their provincial superstitions. More so when he chats with Jerome and realises that despite how very much he speaks, Mr. Jerome says very little. Keckwick, the cart driver, says little as well. The first day Arthur spends at the remote Drablow home is creepy enough to send him home early, but it's not going to be so easy, and the fog that springs up leaves him lost and bewildered. The cries of the child and the pony drowning in the marsh send him into a panic that almost costs him his life. Removed by Keckwick to the village again, Arthur restores himself to the decorum expected of a gentleman. He inquires after some assistance and, initially opposed to returning to the house, the behaviour of the locals stirs in him a prideful determination to return to his work and show that their superstitions are just that. His bicycle ride is something of a lull. Here, the prophetic fallacy, though, is a deliberate contrast. His cheered mood is mirrored in the novel's first bright blue sky, yet beneath it all is the impression that Arthur is trying to convince himself that there is no trouble, when he puts his back firmly to the marshes. But the more he denies his fear, the more it's clear that he protests just a little bit too much. Arthur returns to the house, works in peace with Mr. Bayley's dog Spider, good company. The presence of the animal, though, heightens the tension in the second night. As readers, we trust animals, especially one as evidently well-trained as Spider. We trust their instinct and their superior senses. But Spider's reaction also removes the idea that this is merely Arthur's imagination running riot. The dog's reaction, her hair standing on end, her brave curiosity giving way to terror too. Terror that is shared is terror that is doubled, and though Arthur will clearly survive to narrate the tale in the future, as he does, the same cannot be said with certainty for the dog, good company, brave companion. Her life or death struggle in the marsh is edge-of-the-seat stuff. The finale of this novel and its cruel twist is again more Victoriana. The exposition is at the end, in a low-key moment, two men sharing their thoughts and knowledge, the contents of Mrs. Drablow's papers. The structure of this text is very similar to another school staple, Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde. Even the length of this text, not much more than a school-friendly novella, helps remarkably with the pacing. You can feel in your hand that you're not very far away from the end. And with the opening promising something remarkable to come, things unfold in a way that makes it difficult to put down, as the cliché goes. I suspect a legion of school children will have something to say on whether it truly delivers on the promise, but even that is actually quite Victorian, where endings were typically less bombastic than today. Arthur is very deliberately that typical English gentleman, the kind that probably only exists in fiction. He's generally calm, generally stoic, and only as brave as the next man, the latter of those he tells us himself. He's largely unremarkable, a good foil for the extremes of the location, whether it's the ghostly house or the superstitious locals. Only Samuel Bayley, who travels back and forth to London for business, straddles both camps, his motor car a symbol of maternity among the horse and carts of the area. But local oddities are effective motivation for the more worldly Arthur. He is fueled by the reticence and fear to prove himself as superior, or at least more intelligent, by proving their whispered half-stories are nothing more corporeal than the supposed ghost itself. His bravery might seem foolhardy, but it's convincing foolhardy and typical of the text Hill has used for her inspiration. that he exists on half-truths in Criff and Gifford and relates his own tale, hinting at what might come, translates a continuing sense of unease. As he relates his own tale, we see his extreme reaction to the ghost stories of his future party, mirrored in that of the townsfolk, particularly Mr. Jerome's near hysteria. The mysteries, as mentioned, all come out near the end, with a heavy dose of foreshadowing for what's to come. But before that moment, the mystery of what terrible event might cause such terror in the men builds on the tension already brewing in the mists over the marshes. That house, physically cut off from the mainland at times, surrounded by impenetrable fog at others, is as inescapable as whatever monster lurks in that troubled past. That inability to escape the past begins with the woman in black herself. The house is full of old memories, whether it's the ancient papers Arthur finds or the untouched nursery. The house functions as a structure for them in the same way that Arthur's frame story is the container for his bad memories. The fact that his fear lingers on into Arthur's future, intruding on what should be a happy family gathering, as mentioned, sets a tone of expectation that something significant is about to be retold. It is effective in that, using a first-person narrator, we know that Arthur will come through physically, but not emotionally unscathed. In fact, Arthur makes repeated mentions of his fear, whether it's the long-term effects of it in the frame story or the denial of it in the first half of his visit to Criff and Gifford. There, Hill plays on a number of standard phobias: the grim isolation of the location. It takes 2 train journeys to reach the distant village, and at the house itself, the fact that help is severely restricted by its geography. Events, not just the ghostly sinking trap, are heard but not seen. The darkness of the night is often overpowering. The scene where Arthur breaks his torch relates this. He is driven back to a primordial fear. I was as near to weeping tears of despair and fear, frustration and tension as I had ever been since my childhood. Gradually, I discovered for myself the truth of the axiom that a man cannot remain indefinitely in a state of active terror. Either he is so overcome by that he runs away or goes mad, or he will become by slow degrees less agitated and more in possession of himself. Even without the dark, the fog is disorientating, hiding truths and befuddling senses, trapping Arthur in a location that becomes more and more claustrophobic, even when not full of things that go bump in the night. It was a mist, like a damp, clingy, cobwebby thing, fine and yet impenetrable, salty, light and pale, and moving in front of my eyes all the time. I felt confused, teased by it, as though it were made up of millions of live fingers that crawled all over me, hung on me, and then drifted away again. Above all, it was the suddenness of it that so unnerved and disorientated me. If Mr. Jerome's reactions are the stuff of Victorian, or in this case Edwardian set melodrama, the reaction of the dog builds on top of the fear that Arthur feels. Both are relayed into the physical world through pounding hearts, dripping sweat, by Spider cowering and whimpering where before she'd been brave and inquisitive. The initially pragmatic Arthur, losing his senses and bearings, is an effective contrast building through the night to a spooky climax. In conclusion, that spooky climax, even though the text still has a sting in its tail, might be the novel's undoing for teenagers expecting something a little more grand. In terms of a successful aping of the styles of the gothic and ghostly stories of the Victorian and surrounding eras, The Woman in Black is hard to beat. Susan Hill plays on widely shared fears, the unknown, isolation, the dark and the mysterious, to produce a tale that only the most stout-hearted among us would fail to be moved by. Arthur is a convincing man of his age and relatable in most. The dog Spider is perfectly judged for both the pathos she brings, but also to amp up the shared fear and danger of the story. The Woman in Black is a well-written gothic horror. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's short, accessible, and no less effective for it. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. I have reviews coming up of books by Michael Moorcock, Jeffrey Deaver, and just maybe Frank Herbert too. I'll see you on one of those. Bye.